Imagine the flickering glow of a fire deep in a dark prehistoric cave. Shadows dance across the walls as a group of early humans sit in silence. The air is thick with tension, not from predators or storms, but from something far more unthinkable. One of the tribe members lifts a tiny bundle wrapped in animal hide, and everyone watches wordless. What drove them to this moment? Was it survival or something darker? Archaeologists once believed early humans were just primitive hunters and gatherers. But recent bone discoveries suggest a much more disturbing truth. A forgotten human species, isolated by geography and desperation, may have turned to something unthinkable, eating their own young. But why? And who were they? The cave that changed everything in 1979. Deep within the limestone mountains of Yunnan Province, China, a group of researchers entered a cave known to locals as Maludong, Red Deer Cave. At first glance, it looked like any other prehistoric site. Scattered bones, fire-blackened walls, and the occasional stone tool. But what they found buried beneath the floor would go on to rewrite what we thought we knew about early humans. The bones were strange. The skulls had thick brows, small chins, and a brain size smaller than ours. Their jaws jutted forward like something out of a much earlier period in evolution. But alongside these primitive traits were modern ones, too, cheekbones like ours. And evidence they walked upright, just like us. Scientists were stunned. These people didn't match Homo sapiens. And they didn't quite match Neanderthals or Denisovans either. They were something else. Dubbed the Red Deer Cave people after the cave where their remains were found named. Ironically, for the large deer they likely hunted, they became one of the most enigmatic human relatives ever discovered. Were they a hybrid species? A new branch of the human family tree? Or a throwback, an evolutionary echo somehow surviving long after their kind had vanished elsewhere? But the biggest question wasn't just who they were, it was what they did. Because buried among their remains was something darker. Something that hinted at desperation. Or depravity. A species out of time at first, researchers thought the bones might be modern humans with deformities. But the more they looked, the harder that theory became to defend. The Red Deer Cave people didn't just look different. Their entire skeletal structure defied timelines. They had flat faces like ours, yet their skulls were unusually thick, something more common in much older hominin species. Their molars were massive, their limbs short and robust, almost like those of Homo erectus, who lived hundreds of thousands of years earlier. And yet, these remains were dated to just 14,000 years ago, long after Neanderthals had vanished and Homo sapiens had spread across the globe. This meant something terrifying. While humans were already farming and creating art, a primitive species was still hunting and gathering in the forests of southern China. It was as if a time traveler from the Stone Age had stepped into the late Ice Age and somehow survived. Even more bizarre, there's no clear evidence they ever left the area. The Red Deer Cave people appear to have lived, died, and disappeared entirely within this one isolated region, cut off from the rest of humanity, surrounded by rugged mountains and thick forests. That isolation may have preserved their primitive traits, and may also have contributed to something far more unsettling. Because with isolation comes desperation, and sometimes desperation leads to choices that shatter the boundary between survival and horror. Clues in the Ashen Bonius. Archaeologists dug deeper into the Red Deer Cave. They found more than just odd-looking skulls. Scattered among the stone tools and charred bones were signs of daily life animal remains, hearths, and cooking areas. But something was off. Some of the bones were clearly from animals, red deer, goats, even rhinos. But mixed in were human bones. And not just adults. Tiny fragments of skulls, jawbones, and ribs belonging to children and infants lay cracked, burned, and broken alongside animal remains. Some had been smashed open, exposing the marrow inside. Others showed cut marks, tiny, deliberate incisions made by stone blades. At first, researchers hesitated to jump to conclusions. Could these be burial practices? Could wild animals have scattered the remains? But the pattern was too consistent. Too precise. It looked like butchering. Incredibly. The marks on the human bones mirrored those found on animal carcasses, almost as if the Red Deer cave people had processed both the same way. There were even signs that bones had been heated over fire, suggesting boiling or roasting. The evidence pointed towards something no one wanted to believe: cannibalism, and not just any cannibalism. The presence of infant bones with damage identical to that seen on butchered animals raised a disturbing possibility. These weren't enemy warriors, they weren't outsiders. They may have been their own, but the big question still loomed. Why would a species eat its own young? That's the mystery we'll dig into next. In archaeology, bones speak louder than words. Long after skin and stories fade, the surface of a bone can whisper truths no myth ever could. And in Red Deer Cave, those whispers turned into screams. The initial discovery of human remains raised questions. But it was the way those bones were treated that began to draw real concern. Human bones with percussion fractures, the kind caused when bones are deliberately cracked open to access the rich, fatty marrow inside. Others showed cut marks around joints, indicating precise removal of flesh identical to what was seen on the red deer bones in the same layer. These weren't random breaks or damage caused by time. They were methodical, skilled. Worse still, some of the bones had burn marks, concentrated at the ends, consistent with roasting over open flames. This wasn't burial. It wasn't a ritual of remembrance. It was a meal. What chilled researchers the most, however, was the size of some of the bones. They were small, fragile, belonging to children, infants, maybe even newborns. This wasn't enemy warfare. There was no sign of conflict, no weapons embedded in bone, no mass graves. The evidence pointed inward, and so came the darkest possibility. The Red Deer Cave people consumed their own, not out of violence, but necessity, or something even more disturbing than that. Survival or something darker. Cannibalism isn't unheard of in human history. In fact, it's far more common than we like to admit. From the Donner Party trapped in the Sierra Nevadas to ancient rituals in the Amazon, eating human flesh has sometimes been a grim answer to extreme conditions. So at first, scientists wondered, was this simple survival? Maybe the Red Deer Cave people were facing starvation. After all, they lived in a harsh, mountainous region with brutal winters and unpredictable food sources. If game was scarce and they were cut off from other groups, desperation might have forced them to consume the only resource left, each other. But something didn't sit right. The selective presence of infant bones, in particular, was hard to explain through survival alone. Children provide little meat compared to adults. In true famine conditions, you'd expect the strongest to be targeted last. Instead, here were tiny bones cracked, cut, and burned, processed with the same care as a roast leg of deer. Some anthropologists proposed another theory: ritual cannibalism. In some early cultures, consuming the dead, especially children, was believed to absorb their spirit, their innocence, or even their energy. But there was no symbolic arrangement. No cave paintings. No signs of ceremonial practice. Just fire, bone, blade. And silence. Whatever happened in that cave wasn't about belief or respect. It was raw, practical, repeated. That's what chilled scientists the most. It looked routine. When humanity crosses a line as the evidence stacked up, one question echoed through the scientific community: what kind of people do this? The Red Deer Cave population was already unique, physically different, evolutionarily distant, and geographically isolated. But this discovery placed them in an even stranger category: early humans who may have regularly butchered and consumed their own young. In modern times, this is unthinkable. But in the deep past, Morality wasn't written in stone, it was carved by survival, environment, and instinct. The cave's location, remote, mountainous, and rugged, suggests limited access to game animals. If seasonal starvation was a regular threat, it could have reshaped the tribe's values over generations. There's a terrifying logic to it. In times of scarcity, infants consume resources but don't contribute. In a brutal natural world, that can mean life or death for the group. It's an idea no modern mind wants to entertain, but evolution isn't driven by kindness. Still, it's important to be careful. We can't know their thoughts, only their bones. Maybe they mourned every child lost. Maybe they had no choice. Or maybe, in a world of constant fear and hunger, they didn't see it the way we do at all. The real horror isn't just what they did. It's the realization that under the right pressures, any species, even ours, can be pushed past the edge of empathy. Next, we'll ask the hardest question of all: why? Starvation, isolation, and the collapse of choice. To understand why the Red Deer Cave people may have resorted to cannibalism, especially the consumption of infants, we have to put ourselves into their world. Imagine this. You live in a cold, mountainous forest. The winters are long, food is scarce, and your group is small. There's no trading, no farming, no help coming. You can't migrate. Steep cliffs and dangerous terrain isolate you from the rest of humanity. You survive on whatever you can hunt, but some seasons, even that fails. Now imagine a mother holding a crying newborn in a cave full of hungry faces. She has no milk. The others have no meat. The fire is dying. That child, helpless, vulnerable, isn't just a life. In brutal evolutionary terms, it's a drain. It sounds horrific to us, and it is. But the line between empathy and survival becomes very thin when hunger claws at your gut day after day, week after week. In some hunter-gatherer societies, infanticide was sadly not uncommon during times of extreme hardship, not always followed by cannibalism, but the decision alone was based on who could be spared to protect the group as a whole. And here's the worst part: the Red Deer Cave people may not have seen it as monstrous. In their eyes, it might have been practical, necessary, even normal. But what if it wasn't just about survival? What if eating the young became part of something else entirely, a culture? When horror becomes tradition, some archaeologists argue that not all cannibalism is about starvation. In fact, there's a long and disturbing human history of ritualistic cannibalism, acts performed not out of desperation, but as part of belief systems, spiritual practices, or social rules. Across time and cultures, we've seen versions of this. Tribes in Papua New Guinea consuming the brains of the dead to preserve their spirit. Ancient Mesoamericans offering human hearts to the gods. And eating flesh as part of ceremonies. Even in Neanderthal sites across Europe, signs of deliberate defleshing suggest ritual behavior. So could the Red Deer Cave people have developed their own cultural logic around consuming the young? It's possible. In a small, isolated population, belief systems evolve quickly, especially under pressure. What begins as an act of survival might be remembered as a sacred custom in future generations. Without outside influence to challenge these ideas, behaviors that seem abhorrent to us could become normalized, even ritualized. Some anthropologists suggest that repeated infant cannibalism could have evolved into a twisted rite of passage, or a spiritual practice to honor death, or even a misguided attempt to return energy to the group. We may never know for sure, but the consistent signs, the same bone treatment, the same damage patterns hint that this wasn't a one-time event. It was systematic. And that changes everything. Because now we're not talking about a tragedy, we're talking about a tradition. What it says about us. So what does all of this really mean? That a small, strange human species may have eaten their young in the darkness of a remote cave thousands of years ago? Yes. But also maybe something more disturbing. It means the boundary Between what we call human and inhuman is thinner than we like to admit. The Red Deer Cave people weren't monsters. They weren't demons from a myth. They were human, or at least close enough. They made fire. They used tools. They buried or consumed their dead. And in their final days, whether through starvation, belief, or something in between, they made choices that seem unimaginable to us. But history shows this wasn't a one-time anomaly. Famine struck. Peasants in 19th century Russia. Parents in siege-ravaged cities throughout history. Even in modern times, survival cannibalism has emerged in the wreckage of plane crashes and failed expeditions. When pushed far enough, humans adapt sometimes in ways we don't want to remember. So maybe the Red Deer Cave people aren't just a curiosity from the past. Maybe they're a warning, a reminder that beneath our technology, our civilization, and our sense of morality, we're still animals, capable of compassion. Yes, but also capable of crossing unthinkable lines when the world gives us no other choice. We often think of the past as a simpler time, primitive people hunting, gathering, and surviving in harmony with nature. But the story of the Red Deer Cave people shatters that illusion. These weren't just survivors of the Ice Age. They were a species living on the edge of extinction, cut off from the rest of humanity, doing whatever it took to keep going. In their isolation, they may have crossed lines we find unthinkable, lines between love and hunger, between protection and sacrifice, between what makes us human and what strips that humanity away. But here's the uncomfortable truth. They weren't so different from us. Their world shaped their behavior. Their desperation rewrote their values. And if the same pressures returned, environmental collapse, famine, isolation, who's to say modern humans wouldn't face the same awful decisions? History doesn't repeat itself in the same way, but it echoes. And sometimes those echoes come from deep within a dark cave, carried in the cracked bones of a forgotten species. If we want to understand ourselves, our resilience, our darkness, and our capacity for survival, we have to look back. Not just at the victories, but at the horrors we'd rather forget, because what we find there might not just be about them. It might be about us. If you found this story fascinating and unsettling, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are thousands of untold stories buried in time, and we're here to uncover every one of them. What would you do to survive? Let us know in the comments below.